together. And of course, a periodic table is a classic example of how we group and organize. He created some clusters, began to visualize the information, began to recite it frequently, and really worked on understanding it, because when you understand it, it sticks with you. And he repeated it, overlearned it over and over, and created mnemonics to remember that information better, and even put some to song. And now we have John, who gets an A+ every time he studies. Okay? Now, these are just different ways we're triggering our memory. Now, you may drive home tonight thinking about John and all that mental glue he's been pouring in the funnel. You might not. But I will tell you this, you're going to remember more about glue and funnel because of that than you will if I just listed it for you 1 through 12. Okay? Because it has a context. Now, we'll try to go through as many as we can. I am basically up against the time, so it's your call. If I have the ability to go a little further, I don't want to put any pressure, so make anybody look like the bad guy. That's usually my job. But organizing information, we all know, for example, graphic organizers are a great way with which we can take information that we have, organize it neatly, so students can see it in a very visually appealing type of way. Most of this, by the way, is very intuitive, so we'll go through it quickly. The idea of a funnel approach is basically forest before trees. Give them the macro concepts, give them the folders, and then you can apply information to the respective folders. It funnels it. It goes from wide to narrow. Start on the big level, and then bring it down to something a little bit more narrow and approachable. Okay, the next idea is mental glue. Try to remember it through various types of experiences. How is this relevant to me? Try to associate with a different type of image. To me, tawdry is an example of mental glue. Okay? You're going to actually learn some vocabulary here tonight as well. But you associate with something that could be very silly, like my example. I think it's kind of silly. And sometimes the narrative that you create, the stranger the better. So John's story wasn't so strange. I didn't have any dancing elephants in there. But in theory, I could have. And that would have maybe made the story even more memorable than the story that I did, in fact, present to you. Okay? And here's this example. You're starting with the color red, and you're branching out in a variety of different ways. I'm thinking that what the teacher had asked the student to do is maybe attach, let's say, some random things like daisy and door and maybe one of these fruit, whatever it is. And so the student, or maybe the teacher did this for the student, found some kind of common link, which is the color red, and sort of branched it back till they got to those random pieces of information. And sometimes you need that for a vocabulary list or other things that don't seem to have any association with one another, but you piece it together using something in common, even if they're sort of loosely connected to each other. Okay? Grouping is similar to that idea, grouping and clustering, the idea where we bring things together and we try to organize it based on how they connect with one another. And the idea of active learning is you have to stay after it, you have to work at it. Some memory is not a simple thing. It doesn't come to you on your own. You've got to attend to it, you've got to process it, and you've got to stick with it. But of course, giving yourself some tricks is going to help. Visual memory, the more you can visualize the topic in your mind, the more that you can create a mental narrative of that image, that story, that's going to help as well. And you try to visualize, how does this idea, how will it look on the page? How is it going to look in the context of an essay or a story? This way it gives you a little more to visualize and bring back rather than just information. Information is hard, but when you give it a context, you make it easier. Okay? Reciting it aloud is something we all know. The more that you say it, certainly the more that you say it in the context of teaching it, the more you're going to remember. So if you look at this graph over here, lecturing, if I just spoke to you tonight and that's all you did, maybe you'll remember somewhere around 10% of that information. But if I want you to really hold on to it, what's going to really help you master it is you teaching it to somebody else. And you can have your students do it. They can teach it either to the class, or if you don't have the context to allow that to happen, they could teach it to each other. They could teach it to you. But their job is getting the clarity in their mind to the degree that they can share it now with somebody else. Okay? Peer teaching is a great way with which to do it. And it's also nice because it helps identify misinformation or lack of clarity. It emerges when I have to start. It's one thing when I say, oh, I got it, but then you actually have to say it. And when you say it, it may become clear that you really don't have it. And that's an important value. There's some data associated with if after X number of days, the amount of review, how much was remembered over time. etc. So this one over here says, after 7 days, students who did no review remembered 33%, whereas those who reviewed remembered 83%. And 9 weeks after that, you have obviously lower numbers, but the difference between the two is staggering. Okay, so we want them to hold on to it. We do need to impress upon our students the need to review that information. And you have here the curve of forgetting, where within a 24-hour period of time, a lot of that information is already forgotten. Okay, and by the time you've reached a month, you've forgotten basically everything. That means, and this goes back to the questions I asked you at the beginning, what are the implications for education? So if we're looking to just say we taught it, then no big deal. But if the goal is for them to retain it and do something meaningful with it, then it's a huge deal. And that's something we need to keep in mind.
Okay,
one other, I'm sorry?
Can you just go back to?
Go back to?
Well, it's important to tell other staff how effective reviewing is.
Yeah, I don't have a citation for this. I got it off the internet a number of years ago. It could be that other data has since emerged that would adjust this, so to speak, a little bit, but I think the basic idea remains the same.
Okay.
Okay?
Good.
Are we good?
Yep.
Yeah? Okay. Okay, here you have the benefit. This is the positive one. Whereas, here's day one, you're at basically 100% of the information. Without review, it slopes down as we saw before, but with a moderate amount of review, 10 minutes at first, then 5, and then even 2 minutes, you're going to be able to hold on to almost all of that information. It's a matter of regular review. And unfortunately, for most of our students, we go into cram effect. So we learn it, we pretend it doesn't exist, we revisit it 3 weeks later, the day before the test, and we try to force feed our brain. And that really is not scientifically sound. But it's a matter of discipline, and it's a matter of reinforcing the value of the consistent review. Understanding it is crucial. If we understand the information that we learn, we're going to remember it better. But if it's not going in properly because we're just not understanding it well, then as you can imagine, you're not going to hold on to it, or you'll hold on to it incorrectly. That's a big problem, for example, with tefillah, with our prayers. When the students don't read it properly the first time, and they get wrong words into their mind, then it just comes out like whatever those errors are. It could be for years and years.
And
you have adults. I'm sorry?
I had the students with the same.
Very hard to correct because they learn it that way. Yeah, to unlearn it is extremely difficult. I don't remember, for those of you who are listening to my Abdul Jabbar example from before, I don't remember exactly how long it took me before I forgot that one. But I was sharing with one group that when I was much younger, I was reading a book about I've been into sports for a while, as you probably picked up by now, and there was a book lying around in my classroom that had like the leaders, like scoring leaders and other informational leaders about different sports, and I misread the scoring leader, I think, of the 1979-1980 basketball season, which happened to be Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and it just said the last name and the team and maybe the average. So I read it as Abdul-Jabbar. I don't know why, I just did. And I'm walking around Abdul-Jabbar because I thought it was the funniest thing in the world. And my mother, of all people, corrects me and tells me that that's not his name. And it took me a while until I kind of like got it right. But I wouldn't say Baruch Hashem, but I do now know his name to be Al Cinder, actually. That's what they tell me.
Yes.
Anyway, so getting it right the first time is really important for all those reasons that we talked about, because as you mentioned, to unlearn it and relearn it can be quite the challenge, especially once it's been internalized. Now, I can't delve into this because time doesn't permit, but a 1-minute paper is a great technique because it gives you some feedback and some closure about your class. A 1-minute paper allows you to ask just a couple of questions. You might say, for example, what are the 2 main ideas that you learned today in this class, and what is still unclear for you? Really very simple. It's called a 1-minute paper. It's probably never a minute. Let's say 3 minutes. Okay? And then the students hand it in. Okay? The basic idea is that it alerts you to informational gaps. It gives students who are maybe timid or reticent the opportunity to ask questions. And you do this, as we mentioned during the last few moments of class, certain things like significant points, most important thing, etc. And then, here's an example of a 1-minute paper, right? You can just pull this off the internet. They're not complicated. You can make your own. It's really very simple. And the idea is they could respond anonymously, but if you really want to be able to talk to the student directly, you certainly want to encourage them to write their name. Of course, it would be a private conversation, and you would approach them, oh, I saw that you had a little bit of a hard time with the Pythagorean theorem. Let's take a couple of minutes to review that before we move on, because it seems like that might be something that you would benefit from in particular. Okay, and this way it gives you some specific feedback. Of course, we do want to be checking for understanding throughout our class. We want to be assessing on a regular basis, not in a final type of way, but just for regular ongoing feedback, something called formative assessment. But you can use this as a way by which to get feedback about how you taught and how clear you were, because it is all about the learning, right? It's not about how we teach, it's about how the students learn. Of course, if we don't teach very well, they're not going to learn much. But the goal is not to be a great teacher. The goal is for your students to be learners, right? For them to grasp it. Again, we want them to process it, we want them to understand it, and of course we want them to retain it. Those are all goals, I think, that we share. Okay? Yes?
Can you go back to the
Sure.
thing that we could fill in so we could use it?
Sure. This one?
Yes.
Sure.
1 minute, right? It's
The first question is, what's most useful? Most useful thing that you learned? And the second one, what topic that you covered today do you feel least confident about? You can frame it any which way you want. You know, the idea is you're giving them a forum for feedback, which I think is nice. Okay? Tell me when you're ready. Yeah? Okay. I think you have something similar. Oh, goodness. I'm going which way now? Yeah, I think I want to go back. There's a slide over here. This slide over here is basically what that paper says in a different form. So you have that.
But it's easier visually.
No problem. I'm just saying, you have an example of different types of questions that could be utilized. Okay, great. That's called the 1 minute paper, OMP, and then here are your final 3. Okay, now the point that was made before is, well, what if we're already doing this and we're not being successful with it? So it's difficult to answer not knowing the individual students. Some students do better with some techniques, I'm sure, than with others. And frankly, I think some teachers probably do better with some techniques than with others. Not everybody here necessarily likes to write songs or feels confident in their ability to do that. But I think it's a trial and error process. Let's put it this way. I think that if we utilize these various techniques that we did rush through a little bit, but Mac Movers will bring them back for us anytime we need them, we'll be better, we'll serve our students better than if we don't utilize them. And again, depending on the nature of the information we want them to remember, in some cases certain techniques might be preferable to other techniques. But if we focus on having the students remember, creating the mental glue, the stickiness, the thing that they'll hold on to, keeping it organized and clear and systematic, and piecing it together through mnemonic, through song, through graphic organizer, through clustering and grouping. If we can be conscientious of the fact that we're teaching people, we're not teaching objects, and the people are diverse, and the people's needs are complex and different, and therefore not all approaches will work for every student, and even with the same student who worked this week may not necessarily, and that's one of the challenges. It could be one of the great rewards, but it could also be one of the great frustrating aspects of teaching, is that we can't be guaranteed that this research-based technique will necessarily work for a particular child, but we do know that if we try them, research and intuition both suggest that we'll be far more successful this way than if we don't try them at all. So that, in fact, concludes our session this evening. I'm going to be calling all of you tomorrow to make sure you remember everything. And I wish you all a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to mention to all of you that we do not bring evaluation sheets tonight. So be watching your email. You'll either get a survey link or an evaluation, because I would love to be able to give your responses to Rabbi Hoff, so he knows exactly how you enjoyed this.